Welcome to HortTube. My name is John Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do most Sundays. I think you can see Holly back here behind me. We're getting a lot of things done here in the garden in Raleigh, especially in the last couple of weeks. I mean, we've really knocked out a lot of projects, and now there's more and more angles that I can show you on the camera on these Q&A videos. Because generally speaking, I put it in 2 or 3 different angles because we've got stored materials for different projects all over the place, and but right this minute it's starting. They're slowly starting to go away. The little angles I never want to show are finally coming into. Everything's looking really starting to come together. Anyway, the weekly garden planner, parts of June are now up on it. So those of you who have bought the weekly garden planner can go over there. And where we started selling it 2 weeks ago, there was just March, April, and May available. Now June is up there. I'm hoping by the time you're watching this, the first 3 weeks will have a link. If you can't click on one, the reason is I haven't gotten all the videos up on that page quite yet. And July is going to go up right after that. So thank you so much for folks who have bought the weekly garden planner. There's a $30 code down below that you can use. It's just weekly that you can use if you purchase it right now through the end of April. So it's $30 off through the end of April. And again, thanks everybody for participating in that. We're going to continue to make that better and better over time. Those of you who bought the Learn to Garden video series, there is a video on shrubs that will be up on Sunday, and I'll send out that email to let you know that there's a new video up on the Learn to Garden video series. One is basically learning how to garden, and the other one is how to maintain a garden in the future. That's the difference between the two of them. Okay, videos that went up this week were mostly progress related videos for the garden. And one of them included some footage from out in California because I was in California 2 weeks ago. But a lot of progress going on here. There's plants going in the ground. I've got plants laid out here and there all over the place, and hopefully foundation planting is going to start as well. The front foundation finally. And then if you're asking questions, and you ask gardening questions for this video in the comment section down below the video, I occasionally will get an email asking where they were supposed to ask the question. It's just in the comment section right below the video if you're watching on your phone or whatever. Some people are watching on TV and it's a little harder to access, but on your phone or computer, tablet, you can just ask the question as a comment. Make sure you're including, some relevant information, what zone you're in. There were several questions from this past week, not several, there was like 2 questions from this past week that I read. They were decent questions, but I had no idea where the person lived, and it would probably have been helpful for that particular question. Looking back there, see what Holly is doing. There's no fence back here right now. I also got I don't know if that question, I saw it on another video. Without the fence up right now, how is it having the dogs out here? Holly won't go anywhere. She knows the limits. She's always been outside with me since she was since she was a puppy, really. If getting a dog at 1 is being a puppy. If there's no line of sight between me and her, she knows she's in trouble. If I have to hunt for her at all and she sees me kind of coming, then she knows that she's gotten out of bounds. And so she'll keep a line of sight between me and her all the time. Griffin, on the other hand, I've got him finally where I've got control of him when he's outside, but I think if I turn my back for 10 minutes, he could probably wander a larger circle than I would be comfortable with. So, but that's where we are, but we're getting there. I like to have a dog that, they're always on a leash when we're walking, and they're generally in a fenced in space, but I don't like necessarily to have a dog that I can't trust. And Griffin has been a dog I couldn't trust for several years now, but Holly, we don't have to worry about her wandering off too much. She knows the rules for her to keep her freedom. Otherwise, she goes back in the house real quick, and she knows what she did wrong. Okay, so let's get to some questions from last week. Somebody asked several people over the years have asked me what made me sell the old house in Johnston County, because it had a lot more room than this garden here in Raleigh. My intention was always to come back to Raleigh. I grew up here. We could walk to be a long walk to my elementary school, but I could walk there. To my elementary school, my middle school, my high school, and college are right here. And So it was always my intent to come back. Johnston County, where I was living, which was maybe a 25-minute drive from here, was a good place to find an affordable home. At the time I was shopping for a home in an area where I could afford land for the nursery and where I could, you know, have a place to put all my landscape equipment and all those kinds of things. And it was a great place to raise my son, and it was a great place. But I always had the intent, you know, of coming back to the city. And you know, this is the city I grew up in. I'm 7th generation North Carolinian, which is kind of crazy. So I always wanted to be back here. What you can afford here versus out in the suburbs is very different though, right? And but I like being in this, just gotten it closer actually. But I like being in this 1,000 square foot house here in Raleigh because we can plug the vacuum into one plug and do the whole house. I highly recommend this as a life goal, is to get someplace that makes you happy, and then you can vacuum the whole house from one plug. Anyway, but that's the main reason. I was always gonna come back at some point. All right, so I get a lot of questions about sloped, mulching on slopes, landscaping on slopes, and I know I need to do some video content on it. I'm in the part of this neighborhood where it's mostly flat, but close to me, you know, Raleigh is fairly hilly. There's about, I think there's close to 200 feet of elevation change in Raleigh. We're on the edge of the drop off. The rivers east of us are navigable up to here. So there's a space on the Neuse River and the other rivers that come up from the Atlantic that can make it to this Piedmont Ridge where we are, and then there are falls on the river. So you can't take a boat any further. So you'll notice that a lot of the cities in the east are right along this ridge, including Raleigh. And Raleigh has a lot of elevation gain in the city. So it is hilly in places, and we'll do some video content on hills and slopes because, you know, I never know, you know, from these questions, is it sunny, is it shady, is it water washing through it, is it, you know, I don't know what mulches are available to you, all those kinds of things. So what I'd like to do is go around the city and just shoot some places where people have done different types of landscaping in those spaces, and we'll get something out of that. Let me make sure the camera is actually still working. Okay, what is the difference between water sprouts and suckers? Are water sprouts always a sign of distress? A person has a struggling tree form shrub with water sprouts. What should they do? Water sprouts, you'll get trees. This weeping tree is not going to be a great example of that. But let's say you had branches on your trees coming out, and then all of a sudden you get these weird vertical growths that look like leaders. Like the tree is trying to form a new leader along the stems. Those are water sprouts. Typically some sign of stress that the tree is underwatered, overwatered, root damaged in some way. Some stress has generally occurred. And the plant just goes, man, I need to form a new leader as fast as possible because I believe the old leader on the tree is about to die. And it's just it's a last-ditch survival mode for the tree. When you're asking me about root suckers, are they the same thing? This is where the pieces, instead of the vertical growth coming out on the branches, it's coming out down at the base on the roots. Yes, sometimes those root suckers are virtually the same meaning. The tree went through some sort of stress. It's dying on the top. It will start suckering at the bottom. And you'll see that on lots of different trees. It doesn't always mean the plant's under stress. It could be just a nicked root somewhere that decided to grow some sort of sucker, or you've done a lot of pruning on the top of it. Sometimes that can force suckers down at the bottom. So suckers aren't necessarily always a sign that the plant is distressed, but they can be. The water sprouts on the limbs are almost certainly a sign that the plant is under stress. So slightly different in that way. If I had water sprouts along a branch, I don't know what kind of tree. Let me see, what did it say? It was a tree form shrub. So if you don't have a lot of money in it, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. If it ultimately declined, you may want to give it a minute, see what happens. I mean, you don't have to necessarily, you know, take it out immediately, but it is under some sort of stress, and I don't know what that stress is, obviously, but those two things are interesting. One of the things in the weekly garden, the weekly garden calendar, we do have, you know, information at different times of the year. I'm just kind of checking, you know, just kind of checking out plants and, you know, identifying potential problems on them. Okay, so somebody said they keep adding compost and mulch to raised beds. Do they ever need to remove any of the older material? It is raised up 4 or 5 inches and it's spilling out. Yeah, at some point, I would think so. I would think so in almost all raised bed situations, you're gonna need to replace some of that soil at some point, because all that organic material is just gonna kind of run out of steam frequently. You know, if you're at, if it's gotten that high and it's spilling over, also any rain that you're getting is not going to be absorbed in that bed necessarily. It's going to end up overflowing the sides. So I think you'd want them down below the lips of your raised bed for sure. So I would take some of it out and take the opportunity to refresh some of that organic material that's in it. The organic material can kind of run out of steam a bit, not so much with the soil that's in the ground, where again, I've talked about this, is rock dust. You know, that sand or clay or loam is rock dust combined with organic material. That rock dust has all those nutrients. All these bagged products that you fill these raised beds with don't necessarily have all those components that the plants need. And even if they do, they're going to run out of it. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not rock, so it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have an unlimited amount of aluminum or whatever it is that the plant actually needs. So, you know, keep that in mind. And I do, again, I think I said this in last week's video, when I did this Google search of garden beds, and I don't even remember, I think I was just trying to look for photos for one of the photos for the weekly garden planner or something, and literally every single photo was a raised bed. I think that, and I see just more and more and more and more being sold on raised beds, and I see them popping up just everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. I think if you're young and able-bodied and you're moving into a new place, yes, you can go with raised beds, but also at the same time, maybe start improving your soil in the ground as well if you can, because ultimately, I think you're going to grow more nutrient-dense food, and you can do with less overall materials being used, and you don't have to replace, you know, raised beds, or, you know, in the future. Anyway, just some of Jim's random thoughts. Let's see. So they said Minnesota has no chip drop where they are. So the person pulls over on the highway to get the highway department to drop off chips from trimmed trees. They've gotten 4 loads. Are they safe to use? It's a good question. This is a very good question, because the state of North Carolina sprays some pretty nasty chemicals on the side of the highways now to kill the trees. They used to take machines down the side of the highways, and they'd, you know, take 4 or 5 machines, and they'd turn those blades up on their side, and they would cut all the trees back, and they'd trim all the trees back that way, and then they'd bring tree crews and push, you know, cut down trees that needed to be cut down. And now they come through with a chemical and they spray them and they kill them, and you can see it. You can see brown patches of trees as you're going down the road, where it can, whatever this chemistry is, it can kill mature wood, which is really interesting. And I'm sure it's saving the state of North Carolina a whole lot of money. But I don't want I don't want those wood chips in this garden. So that's, you know, I'm thinking that a herbicide that has the capacity to kill a mature tree is not a herbicide that I want in my garden lingering for any length of time. So be careful with that. Just, I mean, I would ask the question, were these sprayed before you went out and gathered them up? If they weren't, then yeah, they're likely safe, and go for it. But if they were, I absolutely don't want that material in this garden. Okay, so somebody bought a blue hydrangea, probably one of those just in absolute full color. You know, you can get them around Easter. Happy Easter, everyone. I'm even forgetting that this is Easter weekend. So happy Easter to everyone. But on Easter weekend, Mother's Day weekend, some other Valentine's, you'll see hydrangeas in florists and grocery stores and maybe Costco kind of places in full flower, and they're beautiful. And you buy them, and then of course you want to put them into the garden afterwards. And someone wanted to know, so they were told they wouldn't bloom again. Is this true? It completely depends on whether it's a florist hydrangea or not. Some of the hydrangeas sold as florist hydrangeas are good outdoor hydrangeas. It could be something, you know, like Nico Blue or Bluebird, or, you know, which is a serrata, hydrangea serrata. But there, a lot of them that are used are older varieties that are time tested and can go in the ground. A lot of them have been bred in the Netherlands and other places as florist hydrangeas. So what they've tried to do is make the leaves smaller, because you know big leaf hydrangeas have these big giant big leaves, right? Macrophylla, big giant leaves. They've tried to make the leaves a little smaller and make the stems on the hydrangeas a little sturdier and make the inflorescence, the flower, what we call flower ball, that inflorescence larger and larger. And you know, they're breeding specifically to make that hydrangea look like that in that container for a florist type of situation where it's again, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Easter, whatever it is, somebody would be gifting somebody a plant like that. And so some of them are and some of them aren't. And that's the answer. And it's worth, you know, it's absolutely worth putting it in the ground. Some of them just, what you'll notice on the ones that aren't, they'll just die completely to the ground every winter, basically, and they'll just come back up from the base over and over. So they're not remontant, meaning they don't bloom on old and new wood. They only bloom on the old wood. And so the old wood is dying every winter. So it's probably never going to flower, or if it does, it'll have little diminutive inflorescences on them and not big as they were when you originally purchased them. So the answer is, I do know. Because again, I researched this for a while at my nursery, and I was considering growing some for the farmer's market location in Raleigh for a while. And I did notice that some of the varieties that were available are old varieties that are time tested in our gardens, and some I had never heard of. So the answer is, I don't know. What exactly is organic fertilizer composed of? Generally speaking, agriculture byproducts. It can be blood from animals. It could be chicken feathers, chicken feet. It could be cottonseed. It could be rice hulls. It could be all kinds of agriculture byproducts that have high nutrient contents in them. And so it's just organic, you know, it's just organic materials left over from agriculture processes, typically, is what they're made of. They're typically also not in a form that's readily available for your plants. So the difference between organic fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers is typically synthetic fertilizers are usually petroleum byproducts and mined materials. So you get phosphorus, you know, from a phosphorus mine. You get nitrogen from the air. They literally take it out of the air. They have big machines that can do that. And then some of the micronutrients probably come from the petroleum industry. All of those things get combined, and they try to put them in a form that's readily available for the plants. So this azalea, with a synthetic azalea fertilizer, it's going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and some micronutrients that go directly to feed that plant. They're just in an available form already. That organic fertilizer is those agriculture byproducts are not necessarily in an available form to directly feed the plant. They have to be broken down by soil life and put into a form, which is the natural process of the way things work, right? I mean, the microbes would, generally speaking, larger things like worms would start breaking down big materials, and then smaller and smaller and smaller until the other soil life, beneficial microbes, beneficial bacteria, break it down and put it into a form that azalea can use. So organic fertilizers are naturally slow releasing because it takes a minute for that process to happen, whereas in order for synthetic fertilizers to be slow releasing, they have to be encapsulated into something. So that's why you'll see them in little prills. That prill is meant to release just a little bit of that fertilizer at the time. So that's the difference between the difference between the two, and how they affect the plant immediately when you throw them out for synthetic fertilizers, and they take a minute for organic fertilizers. Holly was ready to head into the house, so I just did that. Is it time to prune a leggy camellia in Atlanta? Doesn't want to harm them, wants them to be bushier? Yes, this is definitely the time to be pruning camellias. You've got plenty of time for them to flush back out and bloom again, unless you hard prune them. If you really hard prune them, it can take a couple years actually for them to come back enough to bloom heavily in the future. But if you're just taking back a few limbs that have, you know, reached up and are a bit leggy above down into the plant, absolutely, this is the perfect time to do it, and it won't even slow it down. Okay, that was number 8. Somebody said, where can they find out about garden festivals and things in their area, interesting things in their area? Definitely whatever gardens you have in your area, like the Ralston, their website will tell you all the festivities that they have going on over there. And again, you know, Ralston Blooms is coming up in about 4 weeks, and I usually take part in that. And then Duke Gardens over in Chapel Hill. I forgot to mention the North Carolina Botanic Gardens in Chapel Hill in that garden resources video, and somebody reminded me down below. That was a big oversight. Our actual North Carolina Botanic Garden with all the native plants represented in Chapel Hill is over there, and I go there frequently, and somehow I omitted that as one of the great gardens of the Triangle area, and it absolutely is. But all their websites will tell you the activities they have going on. And then also, of course, through your extension agent and your master gardener program, and then gardening groups in your area. If you find one, other people, you don't have to reinvent any of these things. Somebody knows the best place to go and buy plants, the best place to go for different types of festivals, you know, on different weekends. I think this next week is the Azalea Festival down in Wilmington. The weekend after Easter typically is when that is. And so there's all kinds of interesting garden festivals. I think the Azalea Festival down in Mobile may have been a couple weeks ago, but there are lots of those things to do. There's gardening groups in your area that the people in those groups will know a lot about the things that are go on in your area every year. And then in the video I was talking about, the video the other day where I moved that Nandina Akafuku, the variegated Nandina domestica over there. I said it wasn't invasive, and they said, what is an invasive Nandina? The regular Nandina domestica that flowers and berries, the berries are still on them at this point from last year, and they're about to flower again for this year. And then some of the other Nandina domesticas, like Nandina domestica compacta and several others, they flower, they produce berries, and those berries get carried around. Sometimes get carried around by birds, other times just drop in place and, come up. They're not, as invasive plants go, for all the Nandina there are in this neighborhood, and there are likely, it wouldn't surprise me if there's 1,000 within a mile circle of where I'm at right now that were intentionally planted. There are not that many of them in the wooded spaces. They're here and there. I don't think they're really displacing any of our native plants, not like the Chinese privet and the Japanese privet and the wisteria and English ivy and some of the, lots of other invasives out there that are displacing a lot of our natives. They're just not like that, but they do come up here and there, so they are considered invasive. Somebody has a 10 to 15 foot tall forsythia that is too tall to handle. Should they remove it or prune it hard? It does effectively screen the road near them. So yeah, I would give it a chance. I'd prune the thing hard, and see if you could get it to fill back in and bloom a little better in the future. One thing you'll know, we talked about root suckers on things. By pruning them, you're gonna get crazy amounts of root suckers on this forsythia when you cut it back. You can decide at that point, you probably wanna do some thinning down at the bottom of it, just to completely thin out some of the suckers that come up down at the bottom of them. Those things just they're competing with each other at some point. They colonize so much that you get forsythia does this and it looks fantastic, and then over the years you'll see it take a slow, steady kind of dive in flowering. I got one over here in my neighbor's garden, barely blooms at all, but when I look down in it, there must be 80 plants, 80 separate plants under there that have come up over the years, and they're just competing with one another. So you can prune it hard, give it a chance to come back. When you prune it hard, I'd go ahead and take the opportunity to maybe thin it all the way, thin some of the suckers down at the base. Let's see, should a red maple be removed to allow ornamentals and beds to root in and thrive better? That's completely up to you. I mean, I know I've beat on Acer rubrum red maples, not Japanese red maples, but actual red maples. I've beat on them a lot on this channel for being poor ornamental, being bullies in our ornamental gardens. But that's I'm gonna leave that up to anyone else. But I will tell you, it doesn't get better in time. It'll be harder and harder to garden with it in the future, if that's what you're asking me. Somebody said, are B&B trees better than potted ones? So B&B stands for balled and burlapped. Basically, trees you can grow trees, shrubs, perennials, lots of plants are grown like this in the ground and then harvested later. The one advantage that you can get with field grown plants is you can get much sturdier, typically heavier caliper trees and shrubs and perennials this way. And so there are a lot of perennials that you'll buy in containers at, you know, the box stores, garden centers this time of year. They were actually field grown somewhere and they were dug up and then put in those containers to root out. A lot of the trees that we would get in containers this time of year have been grown in a field and then were dug out bare root. You know, they were field grown like this, but they soiled it and they didn't dig up the soil with it. They just took the tree and the roots out and sent it to someone. So those are field grown. Again, you get more caliper. And what I talked about with those raised beds earlier versus in-ground growing is the exact same thing on shrubs and trees. You know, you're going to get a plant that's more, that's growing more naturally, you know, just in the ground because it has access to everything it needs, as opposed to up in a container where everything has to be given to it, right? You got to, you know, any container plant that I'm planting out here had to be fertilized the entire time it was in that container. They had no choice but to control the nutrients. If I put something in the ground, I can give it some fertilizer to get it moving, but the ground has a lot of what it needs. So there's the advantage, right, of growing something in the ground. Also, you don't have to winter protect it as much because the pot being above the ground exposes the roots to freezing. That doesn't happen if the plant's in the ground, right? And so there's less winter protection required. That's the advantages. The disadvantages to growing something in the field and then taking it out of the field, and I'm talking about now with soil on it, so balled and but they rip it out of the ground and they put it in some sort of wrap burlap around it or some material around it and sell it. The disadvantages are, number one, it's extremely heavy. I mean, very, very heavy. The weight of a 25-gallon container versus the same equivalent sized root ball on a small shrub or small tree is hundreds of pounds, can be hundreds of pounds difference. I also think that once we put them in the ground later, I can take a balled and burlap tree that's maybe 8 feet tall, has a pretty good caliper on it. I can put it in the ground because it got root damaged when it was taken out of the ground, right? Literally, the machine came in and cut a V underneath it and scooped it out of the ground and cut roots on it and then brought it to the house, put it in the ground. This is where the old lure, the first year it weeps, the second year it sleeps, the third year it leaps thing came from, because it takes a minute for that field grown tree or shrub to re-root out into the soil and start growing again. Whereas I can take container trees that are slightly smaller and put them in the ground and immediately see new growth on them that first year. Not always, not everything transitions perfectly, but I'll put a container tree against a field grown tree any day of the week, and that container tree will eventually catch it and pass it. So that's a lot of information about balled and burlap trees versus container trees. I like container plants. I've always liked container plants. They're easy to carry, they're easy to move around, they're lighter weight. They have everything the plant needs, just like the other one does. As a grower, it would certainly be easier to grow something out in the field, except for deer. You know, you're gonna have deer out in a big field like they grow them, that could have an impact on your crops. But from a homeowner purchasing something, I think that overall container plants are better. Another weakness for container plants is the roots can be wrapped in a circle more so than they are in field-grown plants. The field-grown plants may have some circling roots, but for the most part, less circling roots. So care needs to be taken planting a tree from a container to make sure you break the roots apart appropriately. Otherwise, you're going to have more circular roots from a container tree than a balled and burlap tree, ultimately. So again, everything's, you know, a lot of it depends on what you're doing with the plant. You'll notice that most landscapers, if they're getting very, very large material, that's going to be field grown. It's much less expensive to get a tree grown in a field that's 12, 15 feet tall than it is one that was grown in up to a 50-gallon container that's equal size. It takes about the same amount of time, maybe even slower in the field. It's just the field inputs are way less than the container inputs. So, you know, it saves them money. But overall, I would prefer containers overall, but there are ups and downs for both. Oh my God, I talked way too much about that. Somebody asked about controlled burns, the pros and cons of controlled burns, and is this a remedy for Bradford pears or calorie pears that have gotten out into the world? You know, the Southeast United States is definitely what we would call born in fire. Most of the plants evolved with fire. Occasionally, you know, lightning. These large pines that were here, lightning would, you know, hit them, and, you know, frequent fires would happen. I imagine everything burned every few decades probably. And the seeds from these plants, the plant itself evolved to either be killed back to the ground and come back from the roots, or evolved to have its seed actually germinate after fire only. And that's true with some pines and other plants as well. And then basically it puts the plant produces a seed, and it goes, I don't want that seed to germinate until there's sun above it again. Right? And so the best way to know that there's sun above it again is a fire came through, and then that seed germinates. And then there are plants that have defended themselves completely from, you know, fire just moves right past them. It looks like it burns them a bit, but doesn't hardly faze them. So most of the plants in the Southeast United States and a lot of the grasslands across America evolved with fire. A lot of these Asian plants probably would not tolerate it. So I'm assuming that most of these, you know, Chinese privet, you know, it probably does not survive. I don't know if it does or not, but I would think it probably doesn't survive. Its seed is probably couldn't withstand it. And yes, it would be a control for most invasives. I don't know about the calorie pears. It's so crazy how vigorous those things are. But I'm guessing the seed on them is probably not going to be fire resistant. Unless it came from an area that it was exposed to fire. But humans have been using fire for a long time to have the kind of crops that they want. Indigenous people in Australia, indigenous people in North America, you know, they were using fire for herding animals and getting rid of the plants that they didn't want and encouraging plants that they did for a long, long time. So yes, using fire can be advantageous, and I would imagine that a lot of these invasives would not tolerate it. Because of where they came from. They were never evolved in it. So somebody has daffodils in an area that has pretty low light, and they're not blooming as well. They have fertilized them, but why wouldn't they be blooming? They need winter sun. They need sun at the time that they bloom. So I've got some of my daffodils and tulips and other things in what I would consider shady spaces during the growing season, but this time of year they're in the full sun. So that's the important thing, is during the months of January, February, March, April, what is the conditions of that space? If it's in the sun, then that's the place that you want your bulbs. How shady it is in July is irrelevant. They're under the ground. They don't care, right? So they're asleep at that time, but make sure that it's a sunny, well drained area too. You don't want it super, super wet in the winter time. And so that's probably what's going on. They also have brown tips on them. A lot of times, so you can get brown tips a couple different ways on bulbs. One is they'll pop their little heads up back in November or December and go, uh-oh, I came up too early. And then the tips get burned a bit. And then they come the rest of the way out in February, March, April, and they just little brown tips on them. That was just burned from having popped out of the ground too early. The other thing that can happen on these types of plants is they're not particularly good at, if you're over fertilizing them, they don't have a good way of shedding that fertilizer. So you'll see some tip burn on them. So be careful in how much fertilizer that you're giving them. Agapanthus is bad for this. There's a lot of these grassy looking strappy plants that are, you know, lily families and, you know, others that are very bad at figuring out how to deal with excess nitrogen and excess nutrients in them. And so you'll see a little bit of browning on the tips on those things, and it's just overdone. There are other plants that have evolved to, if you look at mangroves down in Florida and other places, you'll see them dropping leaves constantly. Basically, they're able to take salt water up and then put the salt in just a few of the leaves and then drop the leaves off. So they're plants that have evolved to get rid of excess nutrients that they don't want in different kinds of ways, and these things just haven't. And so over fertilizing them can cause damage. You know, we're loving things to death frequently, so that can be an issue. Somebody has chip drop, they have a slag driveway or any kind of hard driveway, gravel, whatever it is. What should they do? You definitely don't want, I mean, you know, that you can load it easily with a pitchfork rather than a shovel like I use. So, you know, that's not a problem. You'll be able to get it up in a wheelbarrow. The problem is you're not going to be able to get it all out of your gravel. So you'd want to, if you're dumping it on the gravel, you definitely want to put down some sort of large tarp or something and let them dump it on top of that so that it doesn't get down in your gravel. Otherwise, it's going to be a real pain to clean it up for sure. If your gravel's heavy, maybe you could blow the remaining part of it off at the end. But if it's not, then the gravel will just blow off right with it. You know, I don't know. Let's see. So they got a lot of chip drop questions. Chip drops for new bed formation, and that's how I've used it here. I've got it in the paths. You can see me standing on it now. And then we used it to start new beds, including the front foundation is covered in it right now. It's a new bed. Can they also use it in established plant beds? Yes. I wouldn't put it very deep. This wood material needs nitrogen to break down. It will get nitrogen from the easiest source it can, which could be the fertilizer that you threw out earlier in the season, or, you know, from the other things that are breaking down. It needs that nitrogen to break down. It actually re-releases that nitrogen later. It's a minor problem, but for shrubs and trees, it's probably no big deal. But for like herbaceous perennials and bulbs and annuals and things like that, I definitely would not want this stuff around them. It would in fact steal enough nitrogen, it would probably off-color them, stunt them a bit. They wouldn't perform at their peak all season. So I'll say that the nitrogen, mulch-stealing nitrogen thing is overblown, but it's still a thing, okay? A minor thing, but still a thing. So I really think that the bark of the tree is the best thing for the beds. The interior limbs and the interior part of the tree is best for paths and new bed construction. That's what I would use it for. But from a money standpoint, this entire load of wood chips was only $20, and that was a $20 tip to the driver. So financially, it makes a lot of sense to use it. If you are going to use it in your existing beds, just use it thin. And then it likely won't cause you any problems. Somebody said this is a silly question, and I want to make sure that I say this. There is no such thing as silly questions. Ask any, you know, there are no silly questions on this channel. Everybody has to learn, including me. I learn every day. There's no possibility of learning everything there is to know in horticulture. 0% chance of that happening in my lifetime, which is one of the appeals of it for me. I get to learn every day. So there are no silly questions. Can a garden without constant amending or mulching of the soil be fine just using like ground covers? Yes, absolutely. You can use the leaves that fall off your tree and ground covers to cover the ground. Initially, when you're starting the garden, it might be beneficial just to give it a shock to the system with something like these wood chips or some sort of mulch layer or compost, just to get the garden, get the engine firing, okay, before you do the ground cover thing and before you do, you know, other things. And that could be leaves as well. It could be, you know, a thick layer of leaves initially churned up and then, you know, used. So yes, absolutely. You do not need to add these things over and over and over again. You get away with ground covers and leaves and inexpensive things, absolutely. But initially starting the beds, I'd like to give it a shock, you know, some organic material on the top that those beneficial things have to come to life and work on and break down and wake the soil up. And then go with the go with leaves and ground covers. Can you use old potting soil from containers in other raised beds or new bed construction? I probably wouldn't use them in my other raised beds because it's no difference in your raised bed versus your container, but you can certainly use them in new bed creation, new bed construction, just like the wood chips or anything else. Yeah, no potting soil leaves this garden. It gets dumped somewhere and spread out thinly and then mulched over the top of it, or it goes in the vegetable garden or whatever. As long as it doesn't have, as long as it's not something from a diseased container, diseased thing, then I wouldn't want to throw it out, you know, in the garden. But never really had that issue here. So things get turned over, dumped out, and, you know, kicked around a bit, raked in, and then they get mulched over later, and it's perfect material to add to your garden. Somebody who had bought the Learn to Garden video series and had a consultation with me said they unknowingly overwatered some Elysium with their irrigation system. They didn't know the irrigation system was just on them constantly, or it just ran for some long period of time. The edges of the leaves are browning. How can they save them? This is another one of those. You got two options. If you think the area is still super, super wet, you may want to rescue them by digging them up and putting them back into a container. That may save them. Some root rot things, I'm not telling you can save. If you underwater something, you can most of the time save it. And there's early butterflies here this year, really early butterflies, which is nice to see, but seems early in March, still March. Anyway, I get easily distracted, don't I? But things that have potential root rot, I'm not telling you can save it. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Certainly if the area is still wet, I'm pulling them out, putting them in a container. If it's dried out at this point or gotten back to kind of normal moisture, walk away and don't do anything and just see what happens over the next few months. There's not much you can really do about it. But the only rescue operation I would do is if it's still extremely wet. But sometimes root rot is irreversible. So there you go. Let's see. And okay, I got a good comment the other day that the garden looked tragic and they thought we were out of our minds just a month or two ago. We left here this year in October. We were gone in October and November, went out to the West Coast, if you follow in the channel, came all the way back home, stayed home about a month, did very little in the garden in December actually, because my son was home from Germany and I had to move him into an apartment in Greensboro, and my mom moved over from Bunn to another town, so I was moving her. We had 500 things going on, 500 things in December, so I only got a little bit done. And then we left in January for 3 weeks and went to Florida. And so yes, this garden definitely looked a bit tragic. And also we knew, you know, the construction had been done on the house right before we left in October. So there's another month right there we weren't doing anything out here because massive construction was going on. But since then, we've gotten the foundation finished, gotten other things accomplished out here, and we're finally actually buttoning up a lot of things, and it's a lot of things at once happening. And I think this garden is actually going to finally have kind of a finished look. But it went, the garden's basically gone like this, and then did a bit of a face plant in the last 4 months, and now is actually going to, I think, be at its absolute best it's ever looked here in the next 2 months, avoiding any kind of crazy weather that we get between now and then. But I read that comment and it was funny, and it's absolutely true. It looked tragic, and I'm trying to do teaching and talking out here, and there, you know, about plants and things, and I know the place looked, you know, kind of terrible. But by leaving the leaves on the ground through the winter time, we were able to walk away from this place for 3 out of 4 months and come back, simply put wood chips down in the paths and mulch back in the beds, rearrange a few plants, and have the place where everybody's going, holy moly, that place looks incredible. That part of that tragic look was those leaves that ultimately made the space look a whole lot better. And there's still mulch piles out here, and there's a pot rolling around right here if you can see that. So it's still tragic, but much better than it was before. So thank you guys for watching, and consider buying the weekly garden planner or the Learn to Garden video series. They're both over on my website, HortTube.com, and there's discount codes below the video. Thanks for watching.